Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're so excited to have you all with us. I'm Haiti, and I'm thrilled to be your host. Before we get too far into the webinar, can you please confirm that you can hear me and see my screen? And again, if you're just joining us, if you can please confirm that you can hear me and see my screen. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. And if you can also let me know where you're tuning in from, we would love to know. Wonderful. I'm seeing Colorado, Nashville, Illinois, New York, Maryland, California, so all over the country. So good to have you all here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. And today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Newman on what educators should know about early literacy development and how to turn early literacy research into real classroom impact. And with that, we're going to get started.
Thank you so much for the lovely intro. Um, I'd love to start, Dr. Newman. First, you've had such an impactful career in early childhood education as a researcher, educator, and policy leader. I'm personally thrilled to be here with you today, and I would love for you just to share a little bit about your research in early literacy.
Well, I've done a number of projects in early literacy. One of the things that I've focused on a lot is book access and the importance of children having access to really good books. We know, for example, and we'll talk about more, that storybooks and informational books are critical for children's literacy development really early on. So that's an area that has been really passionate for me. The other thing that I'm very interested in is all about vocabulary and the importance of talking with children and the conversational turns that are so important in those early years, and how play can really support that kind of conversation, both among peers and adults. And finally, I'm interested in community-based learning. Some of you may know some of my research that shows that places as ordinary as laundromats and grocery stores can be vivid places for children's literacy development. So that's a little bit about me.
That's great. And I'm sure that resonates with our audience today. So we'll dive into each of those. Can you talk about what drew you to the field of early childhood and why'd you stick with it? What inspires you to keep going?
Well, I'll make a short story. I started as a fifth grade teacher, and I was frustrated with my inability to really make a big difference in children's lives. You know, you would see children in the fifth grade scoring at the second grade level, and I said, oh my gosh, if we only had good early childhood, could we ameliorate some of those differences and really close that gap? And so then I went earlier on. Now I deal with 2.5 year olds and up to 5 or 6. Um, and I realized that this is so important because those early years really help children develop not only a great deal of skill, but a great deal of habits of mind that really enable them to learn and continue to learn throughout their lives.
Oh, that's great. I actually have a similar journey where I started off as a special ed teacher in third and fourth and fifth grade in a self-contained class. And I quickly realized that I belonged in a preschool classroom to really influence our youngest learners. And the term science of reading has the attention of educators across the country. For those of our audience members that maybe they're hearing this term for the first time or they've heard it and don't quite understand it, could you break it down a little bit and just talk about what does this mean? What is the science of reading?
Well, when we think about the science of reading, we really think about the accumulation of research that has occurred over time from neuroscience, from psychology, from curriculum and instruction, from teacher professional development, all of which begins to tell us a common story. And that story is that children need particular skills in order to be successful readers and writers, and literacy learners later on. And those critical skills, I think one of the things I'd like to highlight is they're not always the same exact skill throughout children's development. So, for example, when we think of the young child, we have to think about oral language development and the critical element of oral language development. And that oral language development actually helps children develop print awareness as children go to kindergarten and first grade. So these are skills that children really need in order to be successful. And I think the easiest way to describe that is there are 5 critical skills. There's what we call phonological awareness or sounds of language, phonics, connecting the letters and the sounds together, vocabulary, children's ability to understand and talk about lots of words, fluency, as children develop print awareness, can they bring this together in a more conversational way in reading, and finally comprehension. So all of those skills really constitute the science of reading.
Great. Yes. Thank you. And I love that you mentioned the different fields, and I think that's really important to highlight as we dive into this more. And so is it fair to say, and I know a lot of the talk is focused on older children in elementary school. Um, does it matter for birth to 5? Should we be focused on it?
Yes. Absolutely, yes. So I always say when a caregiver and a baby look at one another and join attention, that is literacy right from the very beginning. So when children are developing an attachment with their caregiver, parents and other adults and relationships, that creates a literacy, a connection that is really important because attachment and learning are so vitally connected. So when we think about the science of reading, it's very relevant, though it will look different for babies, for infants and toddlers, and for preschoolers, and later on as children get older.
Well, that's a perfect segue because we sent out a pre-survey for this webinar, and a lot of the people joining us really want strategies. They want to know what they can do tomorrow in their classrooms to support this. So I'd love to actually go through each sort of age level and discuss what strategies would be great to focus on and what's the most important thing to do tomorrow. So let's talk about babies first, because you mentioned babies. What are some practical thing educators can do during the daily routine in their classrooms or their programs with babies?
Talk to the babies. Talking is so critically important because it's a knowledge building activity for children. And what children learn, and sometimes you'll see this if you go to YouTube videos, you often see like a parent or grandparent talking to a child and the child learning the conversational dance that occurs very, very early on. So that child may be saying ba 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 back, but that is indicating that they are responding to the parent or the caregiver. And that response creates a social pragmatic. They begin to learn what conversation looks like and what are some of the social cues that go along with that. Like we listen to one another and we respond and we extend our activities. With babies, physical connection is very important. So one of the things we know about literacy is that literacy is a whole body experience. So babies will often talk in gestures, and you've seen it, I know, but they'll point at things or and those gestures for babies and early toddlers is language. And so we have to take those gestures very importantly. They really are communicative activities. We start also, reading with children very, very early on. So we'll do storytelling or tell the story of how they were born. Oh my gosh, babies, their eyes lighten. Um, we can tell stories to children, and we can use what we call motherese. And motherese is a tone that's very important. And I encourage early childhood teachers to really think of it as teacher ease. But teacherese is the prosodic features of our language. So we say, how are you today? And that up and down kind of language is helping children learn expression very, very early on. So all of those activities are very related to the babies.
That's great. Yeah. So talk, talk, talk as much as you can.
Talk and engage, and remember that babbling is actually talk, and take it seriously, and don't just um, you know, think nothing of it. It is talk. And what adults can do is that they can extend that. So when I'm with my dog, for example, I'm walking with my dog and I see a mother and a child and a baby, and the baby will say, ba, 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 and the parent will say, that's right, it's a dog. So even though those sounds were not anything related to that word, what the parent was doing is using an approximation to really enable that child to learn the word.
Great. Let's move to toddlers. So, how can educators intentionally incorporate, you mentioned vocabulary early on, and reading, and sound play. So, what are some practical strategies toddler teachers could use in the classroom?
Well, one of the things that, and we'll probably talk more about this, but especially with toddlers, one of the things that you should be doing all the time is singing and using music in your programs. So, for example, music is phonological awareness for a toddler. And it is the hearing the sound structure of our language. And notice a lot of music and a lot of songs are actually rhythms and patterning, and they're learning about patterning and rhythms. They're learning about rhyming very early on, and that's very, very important. So we at toddler, we really want to keep our language interactions oral still. We want to focus on oral language and not necessarily print language. That will come. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But what we want to do is make sure that children have an orally rich environment, that they also use their whole body. So one of the things I always show our teachers is make sure that you recognize that when the child is dancing and singing and talking, that's all literacy early on. They're using their body, and that almost becomes a mnemonic device. They remember things when they use their whole body. So that's really important as a toddler. And of course, we're going to talk about play, but we'll get, yeah, yeah.
Um, yes, look, we should definitely talk about play and sort of how this all fits into play. Let's move to preschool real quick, and then we'll circle back to play. What are your favorite hands-on strategies to support preschoolers with language and literacy?
Well, one of the things that we want to do when we get to preschool is we want children to learn the alphabet. We want them to begin to sing I always say the alphabet song is the pledge of allegiance to literacy development. They love to sing it, they love to remember it, and that memory of that song, it becomes a mnemonic device for them. We want children to really begin to hear rhyming more deliberately. So we're going to focus in the preschool years in a more deliberate sort of lots of sound games and activities that relate to sounds and hearing different sounds. And again, music is so critically important for young children. We also, of course, want to focus on storybooks, and not just stories, but informational text, because children are fascinated with learning about their world. And we want them to explore their their world out there. You know, when children are playing and understanding all about worms or plants or things like that, they're using words that are so important for their development. So we're going to really be focusing on knowledge building in through activities that children get to physically engage in at preschool.
Yeah, that's great. Um, how how would you foster a love of reading in children in a classroom? What are some things that teachers can do to really
Well,
foster that?
one of the things, you know, we deal a lot with storybook reading, and one of the things that's really important, I think, is helping children learn about topics that are critically important to them, are important to them, not us necessarily, them. So, for example, one of the things that we do is we focus on a topic called wild weather, for example, which children love, you know, hearing about blizzards and volcanoes and things like that. But one of the things that we'll try to do is we read stories to children that we think are very interesting and we don't spend too much time. In other words, we keep it between 10 and 12 minutes for storybook reading because children have a very limited attention span, as you know. We also want to, in learning about specific topics, we want to really engage them in interactive reading. So, in other words, we want those books to become almost prompts for conversation. It's really important for children to have opportunity to talk about those books and to do something with them. So sometimes what we do is we'll have a storybook reading where we focus on a particular topic. We'll then have a small group activity that focuses on words related to that topic. And then we'll have a discovery center, independent play, where they can learn more about that topic. And that really engages them in wanting to learn about literacy. So it becomes something that they're so eager to learn. It becomes a source of learning rather than just a curriculum topic.
Yeah, that's great. What you said really resonated with me. I have a 4-year-old and he is obsessed with trucks and cars. And so he just wants to read about cars and trucks all day long. So I'm very grateful for his preschool teachers to expose him to different books and diverse literature. Because with me, it's just trucks and cars all day.
But you know, I have to say that uh, his love of trucks. I once had a student, Edward, I still remember him, and he was fascinated with a trash truck. No, tell me why, I don't know. But the trash truck was important to him because in his neighborhood, trash trucks never came. Um, and unfortunately, they never came. And
Mm.
so we would start reading a book, and he would go back to that trash truck and he want to know everything about it. And I think one of the things that we should be aware of is it's really important to stay with that child's interests. If he's interested in that trash truck, you stay with it and you really help him explore all of those things. Now, you might be interested in a whole different world, you know, like world outside the trucks, but it's good for us to promote and extend children's learning because that's how they develop interests. And when they develop interests, they develop a love of reading.
That's right. Yeah. And as a preschool teacher, I remember researching things that I didn't know about. And we sort of have to know about a lot of different topics to be able to answer those questions that children ask us.
Right. Right.
Um, okay, let's talk about play a little bit. How does play fit into all of these wonderful things and strategies that you've mentioned?
Well, I have to say, I'll start with a statement that people will not agree with necessarily, but I feel we often say that play is children's work, and I don't believe that for a moment. I think that play is play. And it is a source of delight for children. And it's not only a source of delight, but it's really a source of learning. And so what they're doing is not work for them. What they're doing is really engaging in their world in very fundamental way. They're taking a lot of what they're experiencing, and then it's an expressive activity, if you think of it. They're taking it and figuring it out, and then it becomes really theirs. So play is very important in children's development. Um, and we want to ensure that we have good play. And I'll tell you honestly that sometimes I go into a classroom and I don't see what I would say great play. I think that we have to begin to recognize and help. Some children will need more guided play than others. Some children have had play in their lives all their lives, and as a result they come in and they can do socio-dramatic play and engage in all sorts of things. But other children sometimes haven't had that experience, and they'll need a bit of guidance in play and making sure that the play is extending their learning, and really engaging them in creativity. One of the things that I love about play is it's totally non-evaluative. Um, in other words, we don't evaluate children's play. We understand it, analyze it, see what is happening. But for them, it's just the joy of learning. One final thing about play is that just remember for teachers, very often we're one teacher and 20-something children. And so it's very hard to have continuous conversations with children when there's so many of them. So play is a time where they really get to talk, and interact and learn about the social pragmatics of conversation. Hi, how are you? Fine, thank you. Some of those things that are so important that you and I just assume occurs in life, but they have to learn it.
I would love to hear more about how to guide play. What are some strategies that teachers can, first, how do you recognize that a child might need a little bit of guidance in that play? And then how do you bring it out and get them to engage in play in a meaningful way?
I think that one of the things we've learned, there's been a number of studies that have examined play in recent years, and one was a meta-analysis. And meta-analysis is a group of studies that basically came out, believe it or not, and said that play was not terribly important. Yes. And one of the reasons it said that is because when you accumulate lots and lots of studies, what we begin to realize is that accumulating studies that don't necessarily have good play, and studies that do have good play. And what they and so a subsequent study occurred and said, why this curious finding that play doesn't have positive effects? And it was because many times what we see is we don't see a good sense of guidance of play. That what we mean by guided play is that teachers will see that maybe children will need to focus on a particular activity, and they want to extend that through the conversation. And maybe children aren't able to have a conversation with another child, so they'll come in and they'll provide scaffolding support for a short period of time. We don't want to take too much time because then it becomes an adult activity and not a child's. And then they need to leave and encourage the play to continue to occur. So for teachers noticing when to dig in and sort of help the child extend the play, use language that supports that play, and then leaves to allow the children to take ownership. That's what I mean by guided play.
That's great. Thank you. All right. Can you talk about the role that curriculum plays in ensuring children get the exposure they need for rich language and literacy experiences?
Well, I think that we once thought that children should just have a good time in preschool and call it quits. But we now realize that preschool is incredibly important. And even, th 3K and infant and toddler programs are all opportunities for learning, really. And of course, what we mean by learning is social emotional learning, physical learning, as well as cognitive development. And one of the things that we've come to realize is that curriculum really matters. And I can't say it strongly enough because my focus in recent years has really been about the importance of curriculum. And I'll tell you why I think, but you might have different ideas. So, but curriculum helps us understand what our general goals are. They keep our goals in mind and they provide us with back mapping, ways in which we can understand what experiences do children need in order for me to reach those goals. So it helps us create a roadmap of what is really important for children's development and what we want to be sure to do in our day-to-day activities. So I think that also curriculum, we have many teachers in the field of early childhood who have come to early childhood from many different domains. Some come from child development, some come from curriculum instruction, some come from applied psychology, some come from all different domains. And so it helps us really create a shared community. And it helps us create a common language that really enables us to come together as a community. There are certain skills children will need to learn, and the curriculum will help us keep those in mind and keep those big ideas as we do various activities. So curriculum is really important.
Yes, I agree. It's sort of it's a starting point, right? It helps you sort of know what you're going to focus on and then be able to support children in different ways that are in different areas of their development. So,
Right. Can I just say one more about that?
yeah.
The other thing is a curriculum is not a script. Um, and what we know is that you as teachers know your children best. And so it's designed to be a guide. We call this structured adaptations. What we mean by that is we say that curriculum has set a set of goals and that those goals are really important. We want to meet those goals, but we may need to have different strategies to get to those goals. Um, and so when we talk about curriculum, we often talk about negotiables and non-negotiables. Negotiables are those things we really want to be sure to hit. In other words, we want children to have phonological awareness activities every single day. But the way in which we do it and how we engage individual children, some children will need more help than others. Some children will need more support than others. That's the discretion of the teacher.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. You've talked about, and I think you've sort of tiptoed around this a little bit, but you've talked about the difference between constrained and unconstrained skills. Can you explain what those terms mean?
Oh, this is a real important topic, I think, that Scott Paris brought up a long time ago. And he defined the different skills that children will need to learn as constrained and unconstrained. Constrained skills are those skills that are finite. In other words, when we think about learning the alphabet, there's only 26 letters. Um, and so it's finite. Once we teach those letters, that's it. And then there are skills. Phonological awareness, by the way, is also one of those constrained skills. We're going to teach rhyming, we're going to teach some of the segmenting and blending, but after we do that, that's a constrained skills. It's done. And the same thing with print awareness. But then there are unconstrained skills, and those unconstrained skills are vocabulary and comprehension primarily. And these are skills that you and I learn throughout our lives. They're you can never learn enough. And it turns out that that designation is really, really important. And I'll tell you why. Um, when we go to kindergarten and we look at kindergarten, um, we'll see that the constrained skills of alphabet and phonological awareness are the strongest predictors of reading readiness or kindergarten readiness, but they fade over time. And so it turns out that the unconstrained skills, those skills that we're using and talking about early on, are the ones that are more long lasting. Those are the ones that predict children's success, not only in kindergarten, but later on in school, high school, and even in college. So, what that says to us, Kelly, is really, really important. It says that teachers have to be careful about not doing too much alphabetic work to the exclusion of vocabulary and comprehension activities. And sometimes we worry that because it's easy to measure alphabet knowledge, we we forget that vocabulary and comprehension are so critically important, and talk is so critically important in the early years.
Yeah, and it's really finding that balance, right? And there's so much to do as preschool teachers to make sure that we're teaching all the skills that children need for later reading success. What are some tips to strike that balance?
Well, I think it's good for teachers, frankly, to have in their mind um, time designations. For example, with phonological awareness, of a quick 5-7 minutes is just fine. Right? Alphabet knowledge. But sometimes when I'm in morning message time, circle time and things like that, I see teachers spending so much time on calendar, so much time on seasons, and I want to say, hey, cut that, cut that a bit. Keep it shorter. Spend more time on storybook reading because that's interesting and engaging for children, and exciting for them. So I really think that saying to yourself, yep, alphabet is really important. We're going to do it every day, but we're going to keep it short because when I use my language, when you examine the language of teachers as they're focusing on the um, alphabet, it will be very repetitive and short and routine, and it won't engage children in the rich language that we need more often. So I encourage them to think a little bit. Sometimes I call these vitamin pill strategies. Alphabet and phonological awareness, they're like vitamins. You do them every day, you need them, but you don't need to spend the day on it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned morning message or circle time or whatever you call it. I always tell teachers, like, yes, you can do the weather. Maybe do it right before you go outside. And then it's relevant to their world. You can track it, but spending 10 minutes talking about the weather in the morning isn't super impactful. And I promise they'll also learn the calendar before they get to, they're going to hear the calendar their whole lives all through elementary school. So that really resonates with me as well.
Exactly, exactly. I always worried when it was October 31st because the teacher would say October 1st, 2nd, 3rd. And I thought, oh my goodness, it goes on forever.
Yeah. I'd love to pivot a little bit and talk about supporting families. We know it's so important to ensure families are valued and part of their child's development. Can you talk about ways to explain, science of reading, but really language and literacy to families, and explain them what does high quality instruction look like?
Okay, so I have a very strong point of view about working with parents, and that is number one, we need to show them more respect than we've traditionally have. Sometimes I'm a parent, and sometimes I remember how teachers talked to me, and I was, a teacher. And so if they talk to me that way, I wondered how they've talked to other people that way. So we have to remember that the discourse we use has to be very respectful and very, very kind and supportive of that parent, no matter who they are. And I think that is central. I always say that there are a number of things I ask parents to do. I ask them to love their child to death and make sure that that child knows that they're loved when they come to school, because don't fight with them before they come to school. Just love them up, because a child who feels loved and attached is about to learn. Um, Secondly, they need to bring their child to school on time. And that is really a non-negotiable as well. That, it's very disruptive to teachers when children just wander in after the day has begun. So I ask them to help me do that. When I talk about the science of reading, I say there are 5 non-negotiables I think you should do with children, and that is talk, sing, read, write, play. And that's how I talk about the science of reading. So if we think about talk is the oral language you and I have been talking about today, right? When I talk about play, it's again the oral language and the discourse that we've been talking about. That's so critically important. When I talk about singing, it's phonological awareness, and it's hearing the sounds of their language and that caregiver language, which will absolutely resonate with them and will be very important in terms of phonics. When I talk about reading, I say to parents, you don't have to read more than 5 minutes if that's where the child is, take the child's interest at heart. If it's a page, it's okay. If it's, don't have any time designations with it. And have a book with you all the time so the child gets to know that books are very important in our world. And then finally, writing. Children love to write their name. And they are learning how to write their name, and they're learning how to communicate with the writing. So very often I'll go into a classroom, in a preschool classroom, they'll know me for anyone, and they'll want to write their name. And then the next thing they'll write is, guess what? They'll write, I love you. And
Oh.
because they love me in particular. But what they're learning is that language is about communication and writing is about communication. So they're trying to convey what they're feeling through their writing. And you know what? The incredible thing is that is international. Those learning your name and learning I love you is an international phenomenon in very many different languages. So that's how I talk about the science of reading. And it really is, I never talk, oh, it's phonological awareness, oral language, and those funny dunny words, because that's a put down of parents. And I don't want them to feel that way.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And you mentioned books here and at the beginning, and I love to hear about, you mentioned books and laundromats. And I'd love for you to sort of talk about that a little bit.
Well, here's my view that very often we have not taken into account, when we think about the child, a 360 view of the child. They're in our care in early childhood education settings only so much. The bulk of their time, 80% of their time, is outside of our care. And so we need to recognize that their outside world is extremely important to them. And lots of times we've talked about parent involvement and engaging parents in children's learning. And I think that one of the things we haven't recognized sufficiently is that the community matters ever so much. So children live not only with parents, but in a community. And that community it needs to be a support strategy for those children. So what we began to do is we began to realize that laundromats, hair salons, nail salons, libraries, oh my gosh, libraries, all sorts of places could be contexts, grocery stores, for children learning about literacy. And what we've learned through our research is that when children are in grocery stores, they learn grocery store words, milk. They talk about milk, they talk about all sorts of different kinds of foods, cereal, fruit, etc. They learn about those words. When they're in laundromats, they also learn about the words. They learn about patterning, sorting, measurement, all sorts of things. And so when parents take their children to these different places, they they should recognize that children are learning those words. So it's very important for parents to engage children in all their sort of routine activities. So what we began to do is we began to put books and children's interactive toys like blocks and paper and pencils and crayons in laundromats and in grocery stores in all sorts of places. And what we found is that children would gravitate. They'd go into the laundromat and they knew that there was a place for them. And they began to engage in literacy related activities. They opened a book and they started flipping through pages and trying to read the story, pretend reading to themselves. And that is a real important activity early on. So we know that if we have a good deal of materials in different places in children's world, what they'll begin to do is they begin to understand that books are part of our world, our environment. Like you don't miss stuff that you don't see. You just don't. So if you see books all over, you begin to realize, oh, we learn things from books and they're an important part of our lives. So that's why we've worked so hard in laundromats.
Um, that's great. Yeah, that's such good work to make sure that children have books everywhere they go with their families. And thanks for the pep talk. I'm going to make sure to talk to my child more when we're grocery shopping.
Right.
Um, Before we wrap up, I'd love to know, I'm sure everyone's wondering sort of what's next for you, or where can our audience follow your work and stay up to date on what you're doing?
Well, I have a website, and which I'm hoping you will share, and many of our books and materials and all sorts of activities that we do, both in the community and in the school, should be there. In our further work, we're continuing to work in laundromats and libraries, and we're focusing much of our work on what we call trusted messengers, recognizing that community volunteers can be very important advocates for children's early literacy development. And some of our senior citizens have been in the laundromat, engaging with children informally, reading to them while their parents are doing the task. And we're finding that that connection is really important in terms of really recognizing that the neighborhood is cohesive and important. And of course, we're also working in the schools. So we're helping, we're working with 3K children and 4-year-old children on narrative and informational text. So those are some of the activities we're engaged in.
That's great. Um, so I'm looking at the QA. I don't see actually any questions in the QA right now. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the QA and we can try to answer them live. I actually see one question in the chat about second language acquisition in early literacy, and we probably don't have enough time to go into it. It's probably a whole other webinar, but would love to sort of hear your thoughts on how to support children who are maybe learning 2 languages at once, or bilingual or multilingual, or maybe even some children who are nonverbal. How would you recommend supporting them in the classroom?
Well, I live in New York City, and we can say that in a class of 22 children, we'll have 22 different language or dialects. And it's such a pleasure to work with such a diverse group. And one of the things that we've learned is that we focus on, and you're going to be surprised when I say this, but we focus not only on improving language, but accelerating language. And we know that children who are learning a second language, they actually have the cognitive apparatus to actually learn words faster as a result of being able to have their first language and developing their second language, which is just wonderful. So one of the things that we do is we relate much of our work on storybook reading and our 10 to 12 storybook reading activities. And what you'll find with multilingual learners is we'll use English because we could not possibly use all the different languages they have. And one of the things that we know is that explicit instruction is really important. So in other words, sometimes teachers begin a story and they'll say, does anybody know what cave is, what a cave is? And if I said that, some children may raise their hands, but your second language learners would not, obviously, because they don't know. So one of the things we always do is we begin with explicit instruction, and we'll say, here is a picture of a cave. A cave is like a hole in the mountain. Can you repeat that? A hole in the mountain. So we'll use a good deal of what we call explicit instruction. We'll often use video or picture supports. We'll focus on nouns more than verbs because nouns are easily pictured and can create a mnemonic or foundation for the child. And we often use what we call a call and response kind of activity. So a dog is a kind of pet. What is a dog? A kind of pet. And the children can repeat. So we'll use a fair amount of choral language. Um, rather than picking on individual children. Because if you picked on individual children, the children who are second language learners will be silent. You know that. So what we'll do is we make sure that everybody's engaged, and we'll often use that choral response to encourage early language development.
That's great. Thank you. We had one question in the chat about babbling back to babies and whether it's appropriate to babble back.
Okay, so I would say no. So I love children, blah, 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 but what you're doing when you're babbling is you're mimicking what they've just done, and it's almost not, they're trying, in that babbling, they're forming language. And so if the child who says a dog, that's a baba, baba. And if I just say baba back, they're not hearing the corrected sound, which is yes, that's a doggy. So in other words, I'm saying that I'm saying that I appreciate the child's approximation, but what I'm going to do is move that approximation to an actual verbal response. I'll do the same thing with writing. So, for example, when children are just beginning to write, they may write their names, with only, elephant might have EFT, for example. And underneath that word, I will write elephant as it's spelled so that children will begin to see what is the adult way compared to the child's way. So I'm giving credibility to the child. I'm always saying, yes, I hear that approximation. This is what it sounds like.
Yeah, that's great. If they write EFT, that's wonderful on preschool because they're hearing the sounds and mapping it.
Right. So
to the
we're
written word.
congratulating them for hearing those sounds. We now want to stretch those sounds out.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we're coming to the end here. So, Haiti, I'm going to turn it back over to you to wrap up.
Once again, thank you so much for joining us. We will share the link for you in the chat. And just as a quick caveat, if you are joining us by phone, you may not have access to the link, but do not worry, everyone will receive a recording of today's webinar as well as the link to the certificate. But we will give it a minute so that everyone has access to the link for those who would like access right away. And if once you click on the link, you'll notice you'll have the opportunity to type in your own name and then you can download it or print it for your own records. So we're just going to linger here for just a minute to make sure that everyone has access.
And thank you so much, Dr. Newman. I read a comment that said they've been teaching for 40 plus years and they learned so many new things. So I think that speaks to your expertise as well. So appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you all.
Agreed. And we always are so thankful for your valuable feedback. So if you would do us the wonderful favor of giving us your feedback today in a brief survey that will show up immediately once you close out of the webinar. It will take about 1 to 2 minutes. We want to hear your thoughts on today's session and as well as any other suggestions that you have for future webinars. More than anything, we want to continue to make great and helpful webinars for you all in support of the wonderful work that you do within your learning communities. So we really appreciate it if you can fill out the survey for us. Okay, and if you're interested to learn more about how Experience Curriculum can help your center, please do request a demo. You can do so at the link that we have here on screen, and we will provide that for you in the chat as well. You'll quickly fill out a form, and someone from our team will reach out to do a customized walkthrough with you and answer all of your questions. And we have officially reached the very end. Thank you all so much for joining us. We sincerely appreciate all the hard work that you do on your end, and we hope to see you again at a future webinar.